A good many of the leaders of the suffragette movement were intellectuals, and you might think that a place like Cambridge, a great centre of intellectualism, would be ahead of the rest of the country in this sort of thing. Yet it was only 20 years after women got the vote that democracy came here to Cambridge. It was in 1948 that women graduates were finally allowed to become full members of the university. And although technically women are just as entitled as men to achieving the top academic posts at the university, of the professors and lecturers and other staff here, only about 1 in 10 is a woman. The only woman to achieve the highest office at Cambridge, or at Oxford for that matter, is Dame Rosemary Murray. She's been head of New Hall since 1954, and for 2 years she was Vice-Chancellor of the university.
I haven't found prejudice at all, because I suppose I've not been looking for appointments as a woman, and there hasn't been any prejudice. I think when I became Vice-Chancellor, a number of people were rather doubtful, shall I say, as to whether it would be a success. But I've heard indirectly that their doubts perhaps have been allayed. I think the women's movements can fulfill a useful function in looking out for cases where they think that discrimination has been affected, and so should inquire into it. I feel sure, though, that no progress will be made by a head-on collision between women accusing men of being chauvinist and accusing them of direct discrimination.
But this moderate attitude isn't shared by some of the women's students. In their view, they have to fight the conditioning which starts in the cradle.
After lunch, John flies his aeroplane with Daddy. Janet helps Mummy with the washing up.
No, really, it means I stop wanting to roll on the bed with Mummy, and I want Daddy instead.
But I want Daddy too.
Well, you're just funny.
John plays at being motor cars. Janet holds her doll.
Can't I play with your dolly for a change?
No, because now I've recognised my poverty of external genitalia, I'm practising for my vaginal phase when I recognise even Daddy can't give me a penis, and I want a baby instead, which is a penis substitute.
But it doesn't look like a baby.
Well, Freud says it does. He says my happiness later on will be great if my wish for a baby comes true, especially if it's a little boy baby who brings a longed-for penis.
Their protests aren't confined to plays. When Princess Anne attended a debate in aid of charity on woman's places in the harem, they jostled and shoved her as she went in. The debate was intended to be a joke. They didn't think it funny at all. It was an insult to all women. And they shouted at the princess, "You think it's wit, we think it's..." Well, even the most ardent old-time suffragette might have blushed. This week I talked to some of these young feminists about the progress of women's lib. They're not impressed by the legislation that's so far been achieved.
It doesn't affect what happens to them between, say, the crucial ages of 0 and 5. And between that ages, and certainly later also at secondary school, women and men are both subjected to an absolutely rigorous set of conditioning factors which make them either take up the position of homemakers or become sort of active men who go out and get dirty at the age of 4 because they play in such a way while the little girls stay at home and nurse their dolls. I mean, we are all subjected to this rigorous conditioning. It's not a question of nurseries, it's a question of changing people's attitudes, it's a question of changing people's minds so that they don't any longer think that there's something inherently superior about being male.
Not every male would agree, particularly Dr. John Casey, editor of the Cambridge Review and a don at one of the remaining all-male colleges. He feels strongly about the inherent superiority of the male, at any rate in the fields that matter.
There's little doubt that although there are very large numbers of extremely competent, able women in most intellectual fields and in literature and in the arts, the most creative achievements, the highest originality is still being shown by men. This is true in mathematics, in history, I think I can venture to say even in literary criticism. It's clearly still true in poetry, music, painting. There is I would say, no sign at all that there's been any shift in one's expectations as to where something that one might call genius, originality, boldness of imagination might lie.
It's at this sort of level that feminism is discussed by the academics. It doesn't look quite the same once you leave the dreaming spires of a varsity for the steaming irons of Walthamstow.
Sometimes it's hard to be a woman.
At Railbrook's shirt factory, the women take a more basic view of man's inherent superiority.
Normally ask the husband if it's all right if you do go out to work, and most times the husband might put his foot down.
You feel a husband should still be in charge of the home?
Oh, definitely, yes. I think a man should be a man, and the woman should respect a man's rights.
It's a part of a woman's life today. So women have to go to work because I think things are so expensive, you know, today. And a woman has to go to work to help her husband. And it all comes part of it, you know, the housework, it all comes in with it. That doesn't bother me.
Do you find that your husband helps with the housework? Because
no, he doesn't do much. No, he doesn't do a lot. If I was to ask him to do something, he would go and do it. But that's as far as it goes, you know. Wouldn't offer.
Do you really feel it's still really your job looking after the house?
Yes. Oh, yes, I think so, yeah.
We all women work as hard, just like the men. So I think when a woman works so hard in a factory and then goes indoors, they work hard as well, do the washing, do the cooking. And it's not all men who likes to help their wife. Even though you ask them to help your wife, they don't really want to because they think, well, this is a woman's job. It's not a man's job, really.
At this level, it still seems very much a male-dominated world. Conditions are infinitely better, of course, than 50 years ago, but the average working wage of a woman is still about half that of a man, just the same ratio as it was when they got the vote. A man manages the factory, and the men back home still fight the idea of being left holding a baby, just as they did in the days of the suffragettes. In those days, the idea was still laughable. There was no real fear it could happen. Mrs. Hunkin Hallinan, a suffragette, remembers the atmosphere.
The humiliation of women, like my mother, for instance, as sensible and well-educated and good background as anybody. And that's another thing that I disliked when I was a child. I could go up to my father and say, can I have some money, you know? But I thought my mother shouldn't have to do it. And she had to do it the way all women did, or most women did.
Male attitudes have mellowed a bit since then, but there are still fields where women are forced to remain inferior, if indeed they are tolerated at all.
I mean, take a thing like the cricket. I'm very keen on cricket, nor my family's very keen on cricket. But I wouldn't, my son and my two grandsons are member of MCC, but I wouldn't be allowed to be a member. I can go there as often as my son chooses to give me a ticket. Or I can go as an ordinary member, I suppose, if they want us. I can't go into member stand. I had to go into members' friends stand.
Mrs. Popplewell would be equally unwelcome, I fear, if she tried to take luncheon at the Pitt Club in Cambridge, where, by tradition, male chauvinist undergraduates limit feminine access to their very elegant stye.
Well, this is perhaps the last of the surviving Pitt clubs. It was founded about 1830 as a male club and is, I think, a very remarkable survival.
The Honourable James and his contemporaries are slightly more magnanimous than their predecessors, who ordained that ladies be admitted only on Fridays and Saturdays from 6 p.m. onwards. Now they're let in every evening, but the principle remains the same. Have you ever come under any sort of pressure to allow women into the club more than they are now?
Well, at the moment they're allowed in only for dinner and for lunch on Saturday, but there doesn't seem to really be much call for women to come in at lunchtime, and there's been remarkably little clamour really for women members. But I mean, we as a committee have always felt that we have been appointed for 1 year and that it's our duty to leave this club as we found it. And I think that the attraction of this club as you see it is that it is a sort of anachronism, but a very pleasant one.
I think what we are fundamentally trying to change, first and foremost, though I am only speaking for myself here, is people's attitudes, that you can't say we just want equal pay, because that battle continues and you...
Well, because an employer decides that the legislation is such that he must give women equal pay, it's not necessarily going to change his attitudes towards women taking responsible positions in his firm or industry or whatever. And what we're up against is people's attitudes, the way they think about women holding responsible positions or whether they ought to be sitting at home with their babies. I mean, it's much more fundamental than just changing employers' minds about how much they pay people.
It was for trying to alter men's attitudes that Mrs. Hunkin-Hallinan went to prison. Do you think there are any issues today which would be worth going to those lengths?
We've got the vote. We can use the vote. We can use other methods. Why haven't we got half of Parliament women or half of Congress women? We can put people in if women would wake up and use the facilities they have.
Women had another chance to use those facilities this week. It was voting time in the local elections. But as in previous elections over the last 50 years, local and national, they didn't seem to use them to any very devastating effect. When women over 21 got the vote, it put them in an enormously commanding position because overnight there were more women voters than men. And theoretically, if a woman's party had put up candidates and every woman supported them, then they'd have swept the board. But of course, in practice, it didn't quite work like that. In the first general election after they got the vote, there were 14 women who gained places in Parliament. Today, 50 years after that, there are 27. That's just about 4% of the total number of MPs.
Well, I think that the point that I would want to make about the suffragettes is that they thought that at least one of the things they seem to have thought was that the according of votes to women would make an enormous difference to the politics of the country. Now, I think when a social class which lacks the vote is accorded the vote, it does make a profound difference to the politics of the country. I think if women do not have the vote and are given the vote, it doesn't make a profound difference because it has no class significance. It doesn't make any difference to the balance of power within the nation.
The upsurge of women's lib in the 1960s, typified by the female eunuch, came partly from this growing realization that the vote wasn't enough.
Men have broad shoulders and narrow hips, and accordingly, they possess intelligence.
Germaine Greer has seen how the movement has changed since then.
We were talking about women actually changing the very concept of power, about the idea of cooperation, a more fraternal kind of societal structure that would, of course, include women and children and the weak and the old and the poor, not as people to whom the state administered, but as people who had power within the state, that is, whose voices were of equal weight. And that, of course, that's really further away, if anything, since I wrote The Female Eunuch. It's not nearer, in my view, because economic realities hardened. The Female Eunuch was written in that period of euphoria when we thought that everything was possible, when kids who left school could knock back jobs from IBM 1 year because they could take them up again 2 years later. It's not like that anymore.
This is International Women's Day today, and you sent a male to interview me and a male cameraman. Where are your women cameramen at the BBC?
But if its character has changed, its support hasn't. There may not be so many bras about to burn these days, but there are still plenty of women prepared to strike the match.
Janet is brushing her hair. John reads his book.
Here, you're not supposed to be doing that.
Yes, I am. I'm illustrating what Freud says are the 3 characteristics of women: narcissism, masochism, and passivity.
How?
Well, narcissism means looking at yourself all over, still trying to find your penis. And masochism means being hit.
You're not very passive.
Well, Well, I would be, but you're meant to do it to me.
When?
When you give me a baby. Well, it says that in intercourse, the woman is in effect subject to a sort of beating from the man's penis. She receives its blows and often even loves their violence.
I'm not going to play with you anymore. You talk too much.
Henry James said that he thought one of the most important facts about the modern world was the decline in the sentiment of sex. And I think he meant by that modern man has, to a considerable extent, lost the capacity to give a cultural meaning to the biological difference between the sexes, so that the difference between the sexes isn't experienced simply as a set of physical urges which people don't understand, to something which has a value in their consciousness, which can actually support an ethic or a set of institutions or even a culture. Now, I think it's extremely important that both sexes have a self-image, have a notion of what it is to be a man or what it is to be a woman, which in some sense transcends biology. Consequently, it's, as the Marxists would say, no accident that one, not inevitably but rather directly, moves through the morass of feminist argument to the well-lit desert of lesbianism.
I don't believe there's a feminist alive who wants to abolish femaleness. My whole argument has been since the very beginning that we don't know what it is. You have given us a disgusting idea of it, a mimsy, useless, pathetic idea of it, which makes even bad mothers. All we ask, is the freedom to find out what it is, this femaleness. What does it look like? If God had a female face, what face would it be?
That's the sort of question that probably never bothered the suffragettes. They didn't have to join consciousness-raising groups to establish their feminism. Nobody warned them about straying into the well-lit desert of lesbianism. For them, the issues were a lot simpler, and the campaign was a lot clearer. 50 years later, there's no doubt that women's lib has made its mark, if only on Mrs. Pankhurst's grave. Whether it's made as much of a mark on history as the suffragettes did, we'll know better 50 years from now.